An introductory webinar. I'm Carrie Mertz, Field Marketing Programs Manager for D-Link Solution Provider Channel, and I have Steve Olin, our Director of Product Marketing for Business Networking, here with us today to present. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Carrie.
And before getting started with the presentation, I'd like to review a couple of important items. One, we are recording this webinar, and it will be available tomorrow for viewing. So you all will receive a follow-up email tomorrow regarding the webinar, and there'll be a link in that email to the presentation that you can use to download. And if you are a D-Link reseller partner, you will also find it in the partner portal at partners.dlink.com. It'll be the first story on the home page. Also, all attendees' lines are muted. So if you have any questions for Steve, you can enter it in any time during the webinar in the Q&A panel, and we'll be addressing all the questions at the end of the webinar. And also, after the presentation, we'll give Steve a little bit of a break, and we'll do our drawing for our product winners at that time as well. We're giving away two D-Link Easy Smart PoE switches, one Easy Smart PoE switch and two D-Link Network Cloud cameras. So we'll do that drawing as soon as Steve's done with the presentation, right before Q&A. But feel free to send your questions in any time during the webinar, and we'll go over those at the end. And with that, I will change over to Steve to get us going. There you go, Steve.
Okay, I think my screen's up there now. Okay, thanks, Carrie. So again, my name is Steve, and we're going to take the next 45 minutes or so and do a fairly comprehensive look at 10 gigabit Ethernet. Now, we have a wide range of people on the webinar today with varied backgrounds. I know we have a lot of IT professionals. We have representatives from our distribution partners and our reseller partners. And I know probably one or two competitors as well. So in the interest of time, I can't really take a deep dive into any particular area. I'm going to keep this at a fairly high level and as broad a coverage as I can on the topic of 10 gigabit Ethernet. So here is the agenda for today. We'll start off by looking at market trends, the history and the growth, forward-looking forecasts for 10 gig Ethernet. And then I'll move right into 10 gig Ethernet technology, talk about some of the IEEE standards that define both 10 gig over fiber as well as 10 gig over copper. And within this section, I've got some review as well, talk real quickly about the differences between multi-mode and single-mode fiber and topics of that nature. And then I've got some application drawings that show 10 gig switches in real applications in business networks, businesses of all sizes. And then I'll wrap up with just a couple slides that show some of the D-Link 10 gig switches and accessories that we have available today. So without further ado, we'll get started here. What's driving 10 gig Ethernet? To me, the answer is pretty simple. It's the need for more bandwidth. Okay, we have more bandwidth intensive applications today than ever before. There's more video. There's really more everything. So we need fatter pipes. We need bandwidth. This applies to the edge of the network. It applies to the what we call the aggregation layer. It applies to the core. Networks of all sizes are needing more bandwidth. And even when we think about wireless networks and how wireless networks today, because they need to increase capacity, more and more users, they're upgrading from 11N to 11AC. Well, that puts even more burden on the wired portion of the network, the backhaul, the uplinks for the access points. And again, just more and more bandwidth is required. There's increasing amount of data that needs to be processed, stored, backed up, and accessible. And this applies as well. There we go. This applies as well to server closets. Servers are becoming faster, and again, bandwidth needs to keep up. We've got something called server virtualization that many of you are familiar with, and that's the ability to take a server and partition it into a number of virtual machines, each of the virtual machine performing one or more tasks on the same server. It was very common years ago to have a server with, let's say, 8 gigabit connections and a couple fiber channel connections for storage, whereas a modern server of today, instead of having individual 1 gig connections, it will have perhaps 1 or 2 10 gig connections on it, and all of these 10 gig connections are shared by the virtual machines. This is a more efficient way of doing things. Sharing the 10 gig interface reduces cabling costs, reduces power consumption, and basically overall infrastructure costs. And it's actually more bandwidth. If you think about it, 8 1 gig ports versus 2 10 gig ports, that's 20 gig of bandwidth. So more and more bandwidth, and networks are getting simpler, okay, with converging traffic. Again, in the server closets, I mentioned fiber channel. Today, it might be common to have the storage traffic actually going over the data network using something like fiber channel over Ethernet. Or in a business network, it's quite common. We see some of our customers doing their IP surveillance over their general data network, or of course voice as well. Right now, I'm talking to you on an IP phone that's going through the corporate network. So again, converging traffic just means more and more bandwidth required, and probably the most important point of all of them is that the price of 10 gig Ethernet continues to fall. And I've got some slides on this coming up, but as prices continue to go down on 10 gig Ethernet, that's really a win-win for IT managers and for networks of all sizes that need to upgrade to more bandwidth. Okay, so let's take a look at some industry data. As I was pulling these slides together a couple of weeks ago, I came across a press release from IDC, well-known consultants. It was rather timely. And IDC talked about the growth of 10 gig Ethernet. They talked about layer 2, layer 3 Ethernet switching revenue. I think this is from the fourth quarter of 2014. Revenue increased 5.2%. In the fourth quarter to reach 2.3 billion. Now this is worldwide numbers, but they're talking specifically about 10 gig Ethernet, and 5% growth from quarter 4 of 2013 to quarter 4 of 2014 is a pretty good number. But they also talked about port shipments during the same period of time. So 10 gig Ethernet port shipments worldwide grew almost 25%. Now that's substantial growth year over year. And it shows what's happening with 10 gig Ethernet, is it's becoming more and more popular, more and more ports shipping. Now it's interesting to note that 5% revenue growth, 25% port shipments, well that tells me that costs are coming down. And IDC even said in their press release, they wrote the quote, despite precipitous price erosion, 10 gig Ethernet is the primary growth driver of the Ethernet switching market. I also had some information from Infinetics, and this is a little bit dated. This is from fourth quarter of 2014. And the first thing we'll look at here on this chart is, again, worldwide information looking at ports. And you can see here along the x-axis is the years 2012 through forecasting out through 2018. The vertical bars, the blue bars is 100 megabit. 100 megabit is on a downward trend, and that's no surprise, but still fairly substantial. If you look at this year, 2015, still worldwide 150 million ports of 100 megabit fast Ethernet. And that's really, again, no surprise. Companies like D-Link and others, we still ship a lot of fast Ethernet switch ports today. But take a look at the next vertical column. That's the red one. That's gigabit. Gigabit continues from a port basis, continues to be on a growth pattern, maybe leveling out by 2017, 2018, but certainly the dominating switch ports shipping today and continuing into the future is gigabit Ethernet. Now the one that's of interest to us today on this webinar is the green vertical column. That's 10 gig. And we see also here a nice growth pattern with 10 gig, and it's not slowing down. So we have good growth on 10 gig from a ports perspective. The other bars, by the way, are 40 gig and 100 gig. That's a little bit beyond the scope of today's presentation. Those are down in the noise right now anyway. So this is from switch ports. Let's take a look at the same data, but now this is revenue, and this is quite eye-opening here. So again, worldwide revenue for switch ports. The blue column is 100 meg fast Ethernet, really insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Take a look at the red column. This is gigabit. Gigabit has been the king, but you can see a decline happening on gigabit switch ports. And in fact, here in 2015, we actually see a crossover point. We see the green columns, which is 10 gig, are actually overtaking gigabit this year. And 10 gig is not slowing down. So from a revenue perspective, 10 gig is taking over and really going to grow over the next many years, whereas, again, from a revenue perspective, gigabit is slowing down. And here's the last graph that I have. This is from the same set of information. This is looking at average per port cost for these technologies. 100 meg I showed just because it's way down there, and it's still declining, but it's down in the tens of dollars per port, or even less than that. Gigabit on a decline right now, according to this chart, we're somewhere around maybe $25 per port. But take a look at 10 gig. Okay, I remember talking about 10 gig a couple of years ago, talking about $300 per port as an average port cost on a 10 gig switch. And now look here in 2015, we're at half of that. We're at about $150 per port. And according to this forecast and others, it's going to continue to drop. Okay, in fact, in a couple of years, we'll be down sub $100 for per port costs on 10 gig. So the bottom line here is that 10 gig, it's a growing market. Costs are coming down, and as we'll see in the rest of this webinar, 10 gigs being adopted in networks, basically networks of all sizes, small office networks all the way up to large enterprise networks. Okay, so that's it for the first item, looking at the growth of 10 gig Ethernet. Now what I'd like to do is transition over and talk about 10 gig Ethernet technology and the IEEE standards that define that. And I want to start by setting expectations. When people say 10 gig, they may be talking about Ethernet, they may be talking about fiber channel, they may be talking about 10 gig SONET, which is used in the service provider industry, also known as OC192, maybe OTN, optical transport network. Here on today's webinar, we're talking about 10 gig Ethernet, not the other technologies. 10 gig Ethernet, which can be over fiber, it can be over copper, and that's what we'll focus on today. And in fact, I'm showing here the IEEE standards, the 802.3 standards that define 10 gig Ethernet. And it's probably a good time to mention here that with 10 gig Ethernet, the IEEE said only full duplex point-to-point links. So you remember back in the earlier days of Ethernet, where you could have a shared medium, a shared wire with multiple devices all trying to transmit on that wire, sharing that medium. They would wait for collisions. If they sensed a collision, they would back off, and then at a time when there was nobody else transmitting, the devices would transmit. That was called carrier sense multiple access with collision detect. No more of that with 10 gig Ethernet. No CSMA CD, no half duplex, no hubs. 10 gig Ethernet is only full duplex point-to-point links. Now I want to step back and do a little bit of review here. Since we're going to talk about 10 gig Ethernet over fiber, let's just review fiber optics real quick. Some of you perhaps are very familiar with the technology, others may not be. But fiber optics is basically sending signals from one location to another in the form of a light wave over a hair-thin piece of glass, a glass fiber. And when we talk about optical fiber, you can see my sort of crude drawing here on the slide. There's some terms that need to be defined. The core is the center of the fiber where the light is actually transmitted. And then wrapped around the core is something called cladding. And the cladding is the outside layer. It traps the light and it guides the light, even going around bends, as long as the bends aren't too tight, of course. And then the buffer is on the outside, and that's what protects the fiber from moisture and from damage. Okay, so later on in this discussion, we talk a little bit about these terms, and I just wanted to define them. The other term that comes up a lot when we're talking about 10 gig Ethernet over fiber is wavelength. Remember, we're talking about a light wave here, and so the wavelength is a property of that wave. It's a sine wave, and so wavelength is basically the peak-to-peak distance for that particular light wave. It's noted here that visible light uses wavelengths approximately between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers. With fiber optic communication, we're using slightly longer wavelengths. We're using wavelengths like 850 nanometers, 1310 nanometers is another very common wavelength, and 1550 nanometers as well. Now, that's not to say those are the only three wavelengths. Certainly when we get into more complex topics like wave division multiplexing, there's all kinds of wavelengths that are used. And in fact, that's a technology for running multiple wavelengths, multiple optical signals down one fiber. They're all multiplexed together. That's beyond the scope of today's presentation. What I really wanted to just make sure is clear today is there's some common wavelengths that you'll see when we're talking about 10 gig over fiber, and that particularly is 850, 1310, 1550. Why do we use longer wavelengths than what visible light is? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but longer wavelengths actually travel better through glass. There's less attenuation, for example, attenuation being the degrading of the signal as it travels through the glass. There's less dispersion. Dispersion is the scattering of the light. So again, 850 through 1550, typically the wavelengths that we need to keep in our mind. Now, another quick review here, multi-mode versus single mode. Multi-mode, I think of it as a lower cost solution, lower cost than single mode. Multi-mode has a larger core, so as the light is traveling down the glass, it kind of bounces around a little bit, and as a result, doesn't really go as far. But in today's business environment and business networks, multi-mode is typically the most widely adopted fiber that's out there. There's different types of multi-mode fiber. In previous years, there was OM1 and OM2 and even legacy multi-mode before that. Today, for any new fiber deployments, OM3 is the typical multi-mode fiber that's deployed. There's also some OM4. Multi-mode is good because it uses lower cost transmitters. It uses either LEDs or VCSELs, which are vertical cavity surface emitting lasers. There will not be a test on this, by the way. But the point here is that these are lower cost. So you can save money by going with multi-mode, especially, again, in a business environment. And we'll see the distances on an upcoming slide. But typically, going from one side of a building to another or from floor to floor, multi-mode is a very good technology. Contrast that with single mode. Now, single mode has a much narrower core, typically 9 micrometers. It requires higher cost lasers, but it goes longer distances. And so we see single mode used primarily by service providers, by AT&Ts and Verizons and the phone companies that are running fiber underground or aerial plant, and they need to go longer distances. That's not to say that single mode isn't used in the business environment as well. It is, and we sell here at D-Link, we do sell single mode optics as well, but predominantly in the business environment, it's multi-mode. One last review here, fiber connectors. I'm just showing here some of the connectors that I've worked with over the last 10 years or so. And I think these are probably the most common, SCs, STs, and LCs. But there's a whole bunch of other connector types out there. A lot of people were very fond of MTRJs at one point. And when we start thinking about 40 gig and 100 gig, there's connectors called MPOs. So this is not intended to show all the fiber connectors. This is really what I wanted to do is point out here that LCs, the one on the lower left here, LCs are typically the most commonly used connectors today, especially when we talk about gigabit and 10 gigabit over fiber. And what you're looking at here are duplex, LC duplex connectors. One of them is the transmit. So the signal goes in one direction, and the others are the receive, where the signal goes in the opposite direction. And one of the reasons that LCs are so common and so popular is that they're used with the pluggable optic transceivers that we're going to talk about, SFPs that you've heard about. So that's coming up. So let's look at the standards quickly here for 10 gig over fiber. And the first one is 10 G-base SR. And it's probably good to remember these acronyms, 10 G-base SR, because we see a lot of quotes come in, a lot of customer requirements come in saying I need a 10 G-base SR solution for such and such. So SR, I think of it as either short reach or short range, and the IEEE standard defines that as 10 gig over multi-mode fiber using an 850 nanometer wavelength. It uses the VCSELs, the very low cost, low power, and you can see here on the chart below the distances that we get with 10 gigabit Ethernet using 10G base SR technology. So over very old, very legacy multi-mode fiber, not too far, less than 100 feet, 85 feet. But you look at, as I mentioned before, OM3 being the most commonly deployed in new deployments today, the most commonly available type of multi-mode fiber. We're looking at 300 meters or almost 1,000 feet. And again, in a business environment like the business building that's shown here in this picture, if I have to go from one end of the building to the other or go from the bottom floor to the top floor over OM3 cable, I can do that pretty easily and pretty low cost with 10G base SR technology. So there I'm circling the most common application that we see today on OM3. Remember that, about 1,000 feet. So here is single mode. This is longer distance, and of course it's going to be more expensive. There's 10G base LR and 10G base ER. LR, I think of that as long reach or long range. ER, extended reach. With 10G base LR, we've shifted wavelengths now. We're using a 1310 nanometer wavelength, going over single mode fiber, but we're getting roughly 10 kilometers, 6 miles. So again, very appropriate for a telephone company that needs to go long distance. Certainly even more appropriate, the 10G base ER, as you can see with 1550 nanometers, reaching almost 25 miles. But in a business environment, certainly on a university campus or a large office park where we want to go 10 gig from building to building and we're going under parking lots and whatnot, then I can see the need for single mode fiber as well, for 10G base LR here. So as I mentioned earlier, here at D-Link we do see requirements for single mode as well, especially 10G base LR. And then the last one to cover real quick here is LRM, 10G base LRM. This was an IEEE standard that came out a few years later after the original 10 gig standards. I believe the standards committees at this point recognize the fact that there's a lot of old multi-mode fiber out there. In old buildings like this one here shown, something that was built in the 70s when they put fiber in place. Remember, if I go back a few slides here, with on legacy fiber, legacy multi-mode, you see 10 gig only goes 85 feet. And sometimes we don't want to rip out the fiber and put in more modern fiber. We want to try to use what's in there. So 10G base LRM used a 1310 nanometer wavelength instead, and it used something called electronic dispersion compensation. And that allowed 10 gig signal to go up to 722 feet here, 220 meters, which is a significant improvement over the 85 feet that you saw on the previous slide. So again, 10G base LRM, really good for using on old, what they called FTDI type of multi-mode fiber cable. So here's a quick summary, 10G base SR multi-mode on OM3, pretty close to 1,000 feet. Long reach multi-mode, which we talked about just on the previous slide, on old legacy multi-mode fiber, 722 feet. And then in single mode, 10G base LR, 6 miles, 1310 wavelength, and extended range, extended reach up to about 25 miles. Of course, the cost gets more expensive as we go to the right on this chart here. So the message here is use what you need, and I think for most business networks, 10G base SR fits very well. Okay, the other thing I wanted to quickly mention here is, as we start talking about optical pluggable modules, is the evolution that happened on 10 gig Ethernet. 10 years ago, it was quite common to find a fiber switch that had what I call fixed connectors. And you're looking here at the top picture, that's a probably 100 meg or maybe a gigabit switch from about 10 years ago, and it had 16 optical connectors. Those are SC connectors, and those are fixed connectors. Those are built into the switch. I can't change them. So if those are multi-mode and they're 100 meg, I'm stuck with multi-mode. I'm stuck with 100 meg. Switches of that nature are pretty much obsolete at this point, And over the last 10 years, the industry has migrated to pluggable optical transceivers. And a transceiver is just a device that takes, let's see if my mouse works here. I'm showing my mouse here over what you would call a GBIC or a SFP transceiver. It takes an electrical signal from the switch and it converts it to an optical signal and sends that light wave down the fiber optic cable. So today, these are pretty much all pluggable transceivers. Why would we want pluggable transceivers? Well, it allows us to have one switch and we can vary what type of speeds we want. If I want gigabit, I can plug in a gigabit SFP. I want 10 gig, I plug in a 10 gig SFP. I want multi-mode, I can plug in multi-mode. I want single mode, I plug in single mode. So the flexibility is within the transceiver, and I can use one switch, one size fits all. So as I mentioned, these optical transceivers went through an evolution over the last 10 years. When 10 gig over fiber first came out, it was quite common to see these big bulky Zen packs. There were X packs and X2s as well. I see SC connectors on the front of this guy. They're big, they're bulky, they're pretty high cost, not very thermally efficient, and not really a lot of Zen packs shipping today. The industry migrated over to XFPs. XFPs were smaller than Zen packs, available in a lot of different wavelengths, and in fact, still used today. We here at D-Link, we still sell some XFPs. We have a couple legacy 10 gig switches that use XFPs as their optical transceivers with service providers and WDM applications, CWDM, DWDM. I know that XFPs are still used a lot because they're available in such a wide variety of wavelengths. But for the most part, the industry has migrated now to 10 gigabit SFP plus transceivers. Just like 1 gig SFPs, but the SFP plus means it's an enhanced small form pluggable. Smaller than XFPs, typically LC connectors, also available in many wavelengths, and this is the lowest cost option for 10 gig over fiber. So over the last 10 years, the costs of these transceivers has fallen greatly, and in fact, today you can get a multi-mode SFP plus transceiver for not a lot of money. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now and talk about 10 gig Ethernet over copper. And the first 10 gig standard that came out was CX4. And this was back in 2004, 10G based CX4. CX4 supports about 15 meters in distance. So it's actually pretty good for within a rack, going from switch to switch or switch to a server or even from rack to rack. But of course, it's not going to be adequate for going from one end of a business building to another. But CX4 was good. It's low power, pretty low latency. It is a big, bulky connector and a fairly big, stiff cable. But there's a pretty large install base of CX4, 10 gig CX4 out there today. And in fact, on one of our managed switches, the DGS3120 series, for 10 gig stacking, we still use CX4 ports today. And you can see a picture of the rear panel of a 3120 switch right there. So CX4, it was good during its day, but limited to distance, and CX4 is now going out of favor. And what's coming in is what we call 10G base T. So I got a couple slides here. I really want to make sure we spend some time talking about 10G base T. 10G base T was a standard that the IEEE came out with in 2006, but only more recently has it really started to gain momentum in our industry. So 10G base T, one of the advantages is it uses the traditional RJ45 connector that we all so love and we're so used to over the years. 10G base T does require Cat6A or Cat7 cabling in order to get the full 100 meters. So if we want 10 gig speeds over 100 meters, we need Cat6A or Cat7. It does support shorter distances over Cat6, but then we start having issues with crosstalk. We really have to pay attention to the quality of the installation. We have to make sure we understand how the cables are bundled and placed in the cable trays. So really, when we talk about 10G base T, the recommendation is to make sure that we have Cat6A or better, Cat6A or Cat7 or better, to get that full 100 meters. One of the other nice things about 10G base T is it's backwards compatible with 1 gig. So we can have a 10G base T switch today, and we can plug in 1 gig devices, and later on down the road we can remove those 1 gig devices and plug in 10 gig devices as we upgrade our network. So more on 10G base T here. It is a maturing technology. As I mentioned back in 2006, there was not a lot of 10G base T. A lot of the components, like the PHY chips, were very large. They were not very thermally efficient. They were very hot, very power hungry. But over time, especially within the last few years, the chip component vendors have done a very good job reducing die sizes and really getting things manageable. So costs have come down on 10G base T. Chips have come down in size and power requirements. And really 10G base T is ready. It has been ready now for a little bit. It's ready for prime time. So we're starting to see servers and PCs that have 10G base T land on motherboard, meaning the RJ45 connectors and the chips are integrated right on the motherboard of the servers. And if not, then it's quite straightforward to upgrade these PCs and servers to 10 gig by using network adapters, 10G base T NIC adapters. And in fact, I've got some examples of those coming up on future slides here. And then the other thing that I find really exciting about 10G base T is its future support for power over Ethernet. So I know that the IEEE right now is working on next generation PoE standard. I believe it's 802.3 BT. And the last time I checked in on what they're doing, I remember reading that 10G base T was also supposed to have future accommodations for power over Ethernet. So I think that's another big advantage of 10G base T. And here you see in the lower right corner is a D-Link 10G base T switch. This is a smart switch, and circled there, the first 8 ports are 10 gig copper ports. And then since we're talking about 10 gig over copper, I wouldn't do this justice if I didn't talk a little bit about direct attached copper. So direct attached copper, a lot of people call these DAC cables. These are copper cables. They use a twin-ax type of copper within that cable, and you can see on the ends of the cable are SFP plus connectors. So there's no electrical to optical conversion going on here. This is all electrical signaling across copper conductors. But we're using the fiber ports, the SFP plus ports, on the switch or on the server. Direct attached copper is actually a very popular technique or technology to run 10 gig over short distances. DAC supports up to 7 meters. So again, within a rack, going from switch to switch or from a server to a switch, direct attached copper is very efficient, very useful. Also for stacking on switches, a lot of our switches have 10 gig stacking ports, and we sell a lot of DAC cables for stacking those switches together. And certainly the industry has recognized that direct attached copper is a much lower cost alternative to multimode fiber. So many of these direct attached cables are available for well under $100, even under $50. And if you look at the cost of a multimode piece of fiber and 2 multimode SFP plus transceivers, then for short distances, DAC is definitely the way to go. All right, so here's a summary of what we just talked about, of 10 gig over the various media. And 10 gig over fiber, all I'm listing here is SR, the multimode, because as we discussed, it's really the most predominant in our industry, in the business networking environment. So you see here, multimode fiber, power consumption is pretty good, less than a watt per port. Latency per link is very low, 0.1 microseconds. Cost per link, I used to say it's high, but fiber costs have come down, so I'll put medium here for cost per link on multimode fiber. Maximum reach, we talked about on OM3, is 300 meters, pretty close to 1,000 feet. Crosstalk sensitivity, basically none when it comes to optical fiber. Direct attach copper, direct attach cabling that we talked about on the previous screen, on the previous slide, uses twin-ax as its medium. Again, good power consumption, or attractive, less than 1 watt. A little bit more delay, 0.3 microseconds, Cost per link is very low. Distance only 7 meters or less. Crosstalk sensitivity is low. And then 10G-base-T that we looked at as well, using Cat6A or Cat7 or better, either shielded twisted pair or unshielded twisted pair copper cabling. Power consumption is a little bit higher, about 3 watts. And that used to be a lot higher, by the way. But again, technology is improving every day, and we're getting that under control. Latency per link, again, not as good, 1.5 to 2.5 microseconds. There will be some applications where that's a deal breaker. But in a lot of applications, it's not a deal breaker, and 10G-base-T will be the way to go. Because the cost per link is low, and as shown here, maximum reach 100 meters. We do have to pay attention to crosstalk, of course. All right, so I know that's a lot, but I tried to do sort of an overarching look at 10 gig technology and the standards. Now what I'm going to do is take a few minutes and look at 10 gig in business applications. And I'm going to start actually with maybe what's a little bit more of a niche application, but this is using a 10 gig switch on what we call the edge, or as an access switch. And this is an application where we've got employees in some kind of a small office network. They're running specialized applications, and they actually need 10 gig to the desktop. They're doing, maybe this is a scientific lab, they're doing heavy-duty number crunching, or maybe this is video editing, and they need 10 gigabit speeds between their PCs and the servers or the storage that's in place here. So what I'm showing is a 10 gig smart switch. It has 10G-base-T ports on it, and as long as the smart switch is within 100 meters of the PCs and the servers and the storage, we can use Cat6A or Cat7 cabling to connect and get these PCs the full 10 gig connectivity to the machines. If the PCs or the servers don't have 10 gig built-in LAN on motherboard, then as mentioned before, there are always NIC adapters, 10G-base-T NIC adapters available to give them that connectivity. And another interesting thing to note here is that I'm showing a laptop and I'm showing a printer, and those perhaps have 1 gig interfaces on them, but I can indeed plug 1 gig devices into my 10 gig smart switch as well. So again, we're out here on the edge of the network, or what they call the access switch, and using a 10 gig smart switch. Now we'll move up a layer and talk about the distribution or the aggregation layer of the network. And what I'm showing here, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. These switches down at the bottom are our edge or our access switches, and these are gigabit switches. These are gigabit smart switches, and they have 24 or 48 gigabit links. And these are going to the offices and the cubicles. They're going to the PCs and the IP phones and the printers, maybe going to some wireless access points. So these are gigabit copper connections, and these particular gigabit access switches have 10 gig uplinks. So I'm showing 10 gig uplinks. Maybe we're using multi-mode fiber in this case, and we're uplinking into, again, another 10 gig smart switch here in the aggregation layer. This particular one is not copper ports. The particular one I'm showing here has SFP plus fiber ports, because I'm thinking maybe these access switches are more than 100 meters away from the aggregation switches. And then from the aggregation switch, I take a 10 gig link and I go up into the core of the network. Okay, so this could be a small or a medium-sized office network. And of course, I may require redundant switches in my network. In case one of the aggregation switches fails, I want to make sure there's another switch there ready to take over, so that all of these users here don't lose connectivity into the network. So I can easily add a second smart switch here into the aggregation layer, and I'm going to use some kind of a redundancy protocol. It may be ERPS, which is Ethernet Ring Protection Switching. A lot of people favor spanning tree, but these switches, these smart switches, support those types of redundancy protocols. So I have protection here. I have redundancy at the distribution or the aggregation layer. Now, if I get into a larger size network, I may find that my 10 gig uplink into the core from my aggregation switches, maybe this becomes a bottleneck. My 10 gig uplink becomes some kind of a choke point because I've got so much traffic I need 40 gig uplinks into the core of my network. So what I've done now is I'm using higher end 10 gig switches here in the aggregation layer. So I'm using, in this case, these are fully managed switches. We call these DXS 3600s, and these actually have 24 10 gig links down to my access layer, to the edge of my network. And these have 40 gig uplinks into the core of the network. And again, I can use multi-mode fiber or something along those lines to uplink into the core of the network. So again, this is where I'm overcoming any kind of a bottleneck that I might have with 10 gig into the core, and I'm using 40 gig instead from these 10 gig switches. And then finally, looking at the core of the network, in a medium-sized business or maybe even a small enterprise office network, I can also use 10 gig switches in the core of the network. Here again, I'm showing a couple DXS 3600s, and in this case, I may be using them as layer 3 type of switches, so they're doing some layer 3 routing at the same time. For redundancy purposes, we're still going to use protocols like ERPS or spanning tree, and maybe even something like VRRP, which is Virtual Routing Redundancy Protocol, up here in the core of the network. So these are fairly sophisticated switches, but certainly worthy in the core of this type of a network. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of a typical business network that's tiered this way, with edge switches that maybe are gigabit, uplinking 10 gig into the aggregation layer, and then from the aggregation layer, 10 gig or 40 gig uplinking into the core of the network. We should also take a look at server closets, okay, because we hear a lot about top-of-rack switching. What's a top-of-rack switch? Well, think about a server closet, maybe in this case a small office, and he's got 2 or 3 servers, and maybe he's got a storage device, and he's got 10 gig links coming out of those devices, and he needs a top-of-rack switch. So here I'm using a 10G-base-T smart switch as my top-of-rack switch, and because these particular server and storage devices have 10G-base-T connections, I can use Cat6A or Cat7 and go right into my 10G-base-T smart switch. If my servers and my storage device are SFP plus 10 gig, then I would use a different smart switch. I'd use one with SFP plus 10 gig ports on it, and probably forego the cost of multi-mode fiber, and instead I'd use direct attached copper, as we talked about earlier in the presentation. So again, this is sort of a server closet with a handful of servers in a smaller office network. We can also look at a much larger data center type of application, maybe an enterprise or a campus data center. And in this case, they've got a lot of servers, they've got a lot of storage, and here maybe we would use a more full-featured, a fully managed 10 gig switch like the 3600. This one has 24 SFP plus ports. We use direct attached copper again to connect 10 gig links down to the servers and down to the storage. A switch of this nature is also going to have more sophisticated features. It's going to have switching features like the ability to do cut-through switching instead of store and forward. And we didn't talk about that earlier, but basically on an Ethernet switch, most of them are going to do store and forward, meaning the Ethernet frame comes in, it looks at the destination address, and then it forwards that frame out the appropriate port. With cut-through switching, as the frame is coming in, the switch looks at the destination address and immediately forwards the frame, even before the entire frame gets into the switch. Why would we do something like that? Well, certainly it's lower delay, lower latency, and in some applications, especially in data centers, having that ability is very important. Also having these data center bridging protocols that I'm mentioning here, IEEE 802.1 QBB, QAZ, QAU. These are specialized data center bridging protocols that are for congestion management, for allocating bandwidth and making sure that there's no data loss during congestion. And again, a specialized top-of-rack switch like the one shown here supports those types of features. So again, I know that's a lot and I'm going really fast, but that's a sort of a look at 10 gig switches, smart switches that are very affordable, as well as full-featured managed switches and where they would fit into typical business networks, not only smaller networks out at the edge or in the aggregation layer, but larger networks up in the core or top-of-rack switching as well. So finally here, I've got a couple minutes left. I have a couple quick slides looking at D-Link, 10 gig switches and 10 gig accessories. The first one here is the 3600 that I showed on the previous slides, the DXS 3600. As you see here in the picture, it's available in two flavors. One has 24 SFP plus 10 gig ports. The other one has 8 SFP plus 10 gig ports. Both switches have an expansion module that you can see over on the right-hand side of the switch, and that expansion module allows a network administrator to add more ports to the switch. And here are the choice of expansion modules. So you can see I can add 8 more 10 gig SFP plus ports, or I could add 8 gigabit, 10/100, 1000 copper ports. I could add 10G base T ports to the switch. Up on the upper right, you can see that's the 40 gig module, so I could add 4 40 gig ports. And this would be used in the example where I showed 40 gig uplinks from the aggregation layer up into the core of the network. And then there's a stacking module as well that would be used for stacking multiple switches, and those, by the way, are 120 gig ports. So a lot of bandwidth, a lot of functionality on these switches, and I'm not going to go through all the bullets here because we covered most of them already, including the forwarding modes, store and forward, or cut-through switching. I will point out that all D-Link fully managed switches also come with a lifetime warranty. That lifetime warranty also includes next business day advanced replacement. So in the event of a warranty failure, D-Link sends air overnight a replacement switch. It's part of the standard warranty coverage. And then again, from a software perspective, the switches support standard layer 2 plus functionality, and then with an optional upgrade, all of the features that are shown here, including the routing protocols that I talked about before, VRRP, RIP v1, v2, OSPF, BGP, layer 3 multicasting, MPLS, and et cetera. Then the other thing I wanted to briefly touch upon here was we recently announced, and we're very excited about our 10 gig smart switches. Showing the first two here, the one on the left is the copper switch, 10G base T. It's 12 ports. The majority of the ports are 10 gig copper, and then the one on the right is mostly optical SFP plus 10 gig connections. These are low cost, they're very affordable, and as I said, we're very excited to have these available now. And in fact, the 12TC that's shown here is already shipping. The first 8 ports, as you see in the photo, the first 8 ports are 10 gig copper, 10G base T. The next 2 ports are 10 gig optical with SFP plus ports. And then ports 11 and 12 are what we call combo ports, supporting either copper or fiber operation. Because these are part of the 1210 series of smart switches, they support all the features that are shown over on the left, VLAN, QoS, bandwidth limiting, etc. And probably more important, the security features that our 1210 series is known for, like ACLs and broadcast storm control and D-Link safeguard engine, etc. And then the sister product is the 12SC. This is basically the same product, but instead of 10G base T ports, you see here the first 10 ports are optical, 10 gig SFP plus ports, and then ports 11 and 12 are combo ports. This product will be available in a couple months in the June timeframe. I see this one as being ideal as an aggregation switch, as I showed on earlier slides. Aggregation switch for many of our gigabit switches that have 10 gig uplinks, like the 1510, the 3420, and the 3620. And in fact, here are the 1510, the 3420, and the 3620. These are gigabit switch, typically 24 or 48 ports of gigabit. And then as shown here, circled, all of these switches have either 2 or 4 10 gig uplink ports that would uplink into perhaps the 10 gig smart switches that I showed. Real quick here, from a network adapter perspective, we have 10 gig NIC cards today. The 810S on the upper left, that's one port of 10 gig optical. That's currently shipping today. The 820T in the center of the diagram here, that's 2 ports of 10G base T copper. That'll be available starting next month. And then the one on the right, we follow up in the June timeframe. That's a single port of 10G base T copper. And notice, by the way, no fan on the single port 10G base T copper. Again, that goes back to our earlier discussion about the fact that the chips now are getting much more thermally efficient than they used to be, and less cooling is required. From a transceiver's perspective, D-Link offers a variety of optical transceivers. What I wanted to focus on were the 10 gig products. We still do have XFPs, multi-mode and single mode, but the majority of the business we do are with the SFP pluses, single mode, multi-mode, as well as the long reach multi-mode that we talked about earlier. And then direct attach cables, no need to dwell on those, but we do a fairly good business on direct attach cables, as those are excellent solution for short distances for 10 gigabit. All right, so I know I ran a little bit late, but a quick summary here on what we talked about. We looked at IDC and Infinetics information, and we know that 10 gig market is growing, and in fact, from a switch revenue perspective, we saw that 10 gig will overtake gigabit revenue this year worldwide, and we also saw that 10 gig costs are shrinking, and so as costs continue to go down, more and more IT managers and networks of all sizes find 10 gigabit Ethernet to be affordable. So 10 gig Ethernet is really not just for data centers anymore. We've got exciting new low-cost, affordable smart switches. Optics prices continue to go down for 10 gig over fiber, and 10G base T is ready for prime time. And then finally, we saw that 10 gig Ethernet can be used pretty much anywhere in the network now, either at the edge for specialized applications, 10 gig to the desktop, as an aggregation switch, or in the core of the network. Again, affordable for networks of all sizes. So that's it. I know it was a lot of information. I tried to run through it as quickly as I could. Hopefully that was beneficial, and we got something out of that. So let me take a minute here just to gather myself, and Carrie, you want to step back in, and I'll start taking a look at questions that came in.
Yep, thanks, Steve. That was great information, and we did get some questions that came in, so I'll let you review those and catch your breath. And if you have a question, go ahead and send it in. We'll just keep going through them until the webinar is over, and if we don't get to your question, we can definitely follow up with you after, so don't worry about that. And then also, while Steve's catching his breath, I will discuss choose our winners for the prizes that we're giving away today. So for our first one, the PoE switch, we have an attendee out of Minnesota that is our winner, and it's Andrew Cummins. So Andrew out of Minnesota, you are the winner for the PoE switch. And then for our D-Link Cloud camera, we have a winner out of New Jersey, and it's Howard Feld. So Howard out of New Jersey, we have a D-Link Cloud camera for you. And then also our second winner for the camera is an attendee out of Texas, and it's Jim Johnston. So we have two winners for cameras and one for the PoE switch, and we will follow up with you after the webinar to figure out logistics on getting you those prizes. And so thank you everyone for attending, and I will hand it over to Steve to start answering some questions. You ready?
Yeah, let me see. I kind of want to be able to read. Maybe I'll read from your screen. So the first comment from Tony is about bandwidth and its relation to latency. And he's making a point here that bandwidth is only part of it, and having lower latency is also important. And for certain applications, I agree with that 100%. So we talked a little bit about latency in this presentation, and mentioning things like going over fiber is lower latency than you would get over 10G base T copper. So I tried to be clear, you know, different applications. Here at D-Link, we sell into a lot of different businesses, a lot of different applications. And certainly for some, especially in the data center, where, you know, disk access is very important, then fiber, multi-mode fiber may be optimal as opposed to something like 10G base T. It all depends on the application. It all depends on the size of the network and what's being done. There's a question about whether Cat6e is supported with 10G base T. I'm not super familiar with Cat6e. I know that the standard for 10G base T says Cat6a or better, which is Cat7, or even better than Cat7. I know they're working on others like Cat8 and whatnot now. The standard does talk about on Cat6 going limited distance, and anything beyond that, like 5e or Cat5, I don't think anything's covered in the standard. I think some vendors talk about you can do it over short distances, but I don't really think it's recommended. I think optimally it's better to use the appropriate cabling and ensure you get the full distance and the full bandwidth. There's a question about D-Link and our forecasts here for 10 gig revenues versus 1 gig revenues, and I don't really have an answer on that right now. What I do know is that especially with the new smart switches that we're shipping now, we have seen a tremendous interest in 10 gig Ethernet, and that's going to continue to grow. The next question is asking whether a copy of the slides would be available, and well,
Yep.
Certainly this will be available recorded version.
Yep, I meant to remind everyone that starting tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email, and there'll be a link in there where you can watch the recorded version and also download the slides.
Okay. The next question is back to 10G base T and whether Cat 6A and Cat 7 are shielded. And I believe as long as you use 6A or 7, you'll get the full 100 meters. I think in general 6A is not shielded, and 7 you have a choice. It can be shielded or it cannot be shielded. I may have that backwards. That may be applicable to 6A. But in any case, as long as you have 6A or 7, I believe the standard indicates that 100 meters is achievable. The next question, again on 10G base T, is when will PoE be part of the 10G base T standard? I don't know. I'm assuming that it takes a couple years for the IEEE to come out with these standards, and it's been a couple months since I've checked in on their website as far as how they're coming on 802.3 BT. So I will continue to check that and keep up on that, and as we do our quarterly webinars with our reseller partners, I'll try to keep an updated status on that. But I don't really know. My guess is at least a year or so before we see PoE on 10G base T. There's another topic here on the cabling types and the difference between OM3 fiber and the latencies that you see, and I think I'm going to hold off on that. It's a little bit beyond the scope of today's discussion. We can save that for another time because I'm out of time here. Larger 10G base T. When are the larger 10G base T switches going to be available? So what I showed were 12-port 10G base T smart switches. There are other switches on D-Link's roadmap for later in the year, but really don't have time frames or dates right now for additional 10 gig switches. Right now, our focus is on the ones that I showed, the 10G base T and the SFP plus smart switches in our 1210 series, as well as the 3600 that we've been shipping for the last couple of years. The 1210 you showed first is available now. Yes, it is, Bill. The DXS 1210-12TC is shipping as we speak, and for more information you can go to our website. Got data sheet and information up on the website, and talk to your D-Link sales rep as well. DXE 820T is X16 PCE implementation. I think it's X4, but I need to go back and check on that, and I don't have that up right now. For Bill, who's asking about the PCI Express interface on the dual port 10G base T, I'll get back with you offline. I don't want to derail this now, but I've got that information just not in front of me. For prices, somebody's asking about prices. Get with your D-Link sales rep. I've got information here on the last slide. Can we see the last slide? We can. 888-331-8686 or an email to sales@dlink.com. My email's on here as well for specific questions, but for questions on pricing and whatnot, certainly feel free to come in through D-Link sales. What was the aggregation smart switch head unit number? So when we were talking about the aggregation layer and the smart switches, with 10G base T, that SKU number was DXS-1210-12TC. The similar switch with SFP plus connectors was DXS-1210-12SC. We'll add to my network of D-Link cameras. That's not really a question. Briefly talk about cable for 40 gigabit. So there's a question on cabling for 40 gigabit. I'm not super familiar with 40 gigabit, to be honest with you. On the 40 gig that we have on our uplink module on the 3600, that's actually what's called a QSFP plus connector, and it's 4 lanes of 10 gigabit. So we actually have a direct attach cable that, in the interest of time, I didn't show, but it's a 40 gig QSFP plus connector on one end, and of course 40 gig QSFP plus on the other end if you're taking 40 gig up into the core. But we also have a breakout cable that takes 40 gig on one end and breaks out into 4 lanes of 10 gig SFP pluses. So you could actually convert 40 gig into 10 gig. That's something that really was beyond the scope of today's presentation. There's more discussion on latency, and in the interest of time, I really think we should take that offline. That's more latency questions there. Boy, I know next time I give this presentation to focus a lot more on delay and latency. Timeline on when we can see 48-port copper switches. From a D-Link perspective, no, I don't know what to tell you on that. I remember a couple of years ago when having 10G base T, just having 8 ports of 10G base T required a lot of power and a lot of heat. And now, you know, we're up to, at least on our smart switches, 12 ports. The industry will get to 24 and 48 ports as the die sizes on the chips continue to get smaller and smaller, but I don't have a specific date on this particular question. 10G base T 6A cat cable. Oh, somebody here is answering UTP, foiled UTP is recommended. So somebody, I think, is providing some information that it's recommended to have foiled or shielded Cat 6A on 10G base T. Cat 6, Cat 6. I think we're done. I think we pretty much covered all the questions here, and I've gone over my hour of allocated time. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here. But again, for additional questions, if it's really something specific, you can email me. If it's more on the products and on resellers, certainly feel free to contact your local D-Link reseller. And I'm getting tongue-tied. So I think that's it.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for attending, and congratulations to our winners. We hope we see you all on another webinar. Thank you.